Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you couldn't see the danger standing right in front of you? Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover that the person you thought you knew was actually a carefully constructed illusion designed to destroy you? I'm sitting here today, alive and free, but there was a time when I genuinely believed I wouldn't make it out of the darkness that consumed my life. My name doesn't matter. What matters is my story. Because if even one person recognizes themselves in what I'm about to tell you, if even one soul sees the warning signs I missed, then every painful moment I endured will have meant something. This isn't just a story about a broken engagement or a failed relationship. This is a story about survival, about recognizing a predator who wore the mask of Prince Charming, and about the pattern of psychological abuse that nearly cost me everything I was. I need you to understand something from the very beginning. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't naive in the way you might think, and I wasn't weak. I was a successful marketing executive with a master's degree. I had amazing friends, a supportive family, and I thought I knew what red flags looked like. But he was different. He was sophisticated in his manipulation, patient in his destruction, and terrifyingly calculated in the way he dismantled my sense of self piece by piece. The day he canceled our wedding, just 3 weeks before we were supposed to stand at that altar and exchange vows, I thought my life was over. I remember the exact moment, the exact words, the exact tone of his voice when he delivered the news that shattered my entire world. We were supposed to be finalizing the seating chart that evening. My mother had just sent over the final head count, and I was sitting in our apartment feeling excited about becoming his wife. He walked in from work, didn't even kiss me hello like he usually did, and just stood there in the doorway of our bedroom with this cold, almost satisfied expression on his face. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "The wedding is off. I don't want to marry you." Just like that. No explanation, no room for discussion, no emotion whatsoever. When I asked him why, when I begged him to talk to me, to tell me what was wrong, to give me a chance to understand what had changed, he simply looked at me with what I can only describe as contempt and said, "You're not who I thought you were. I've made a mistake and I'm correcting it now." The cruelty in those words, the calculated coldness, the absolute absence of any recognition of what we'd built together over 2 years. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out my heart while it was still beating. I collapsed. I literally fell to my knees on our bedroom floor and felt something inside me break that I didn't know could break. But here's what I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly have understood in that moment of devastating pain. That cancellation, as brutal and traumatic as it wasn't the end of his plan for me. It was actually just another phase in a carefully orchestrated pattern of psychological abuse that he had perfected over years, with multiple women before me, and I was simply the latest victim in his gallery of broken souls. This is the story of how I uncovered that pattern, how I connected dots I didn't even know existed, and how I escaped before he could complete the final phase of his twisted game. This is the story of how I lived to tell what he tried to make sure I would never be able to say. I met Daniel on a rainy Thursday evening in October, 3 years before that terrible day when he canceled our wedding. I had just finished a brutal presentation at work, one of those high-stakes client meetings where everything needs to be perfect, and one mistake could cost the company millions in lost business. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and desperately needed a glass of wine and some mindless scrolling through my phone to decompress. My best friend Sarah had been begging me for weeks to try this new wine bar that had opened in downtown, one of those trendy places with exposed brick walls and Edison bulb lighting that every millennial flocked to for their Instagram photos. I normally would have gone straight home, put on my comfortable clothes, and ordered takeout, but something that evening made me text her back and say yes. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was the universe setting up the greatest lesson I would ever learn, or maybe it was just random chance, but I agreed to meet her there at 7. When I walked into that wine bar, shaking the rain from my coat and looking around for Sarah's familiar face, I saw him immediately. He was sitting at the bar, alone, reading a book, and there was something about the way he looked, the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own company, that caught my attention. He had dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, strong features, and he was wearing a well-fitted charcoal sweater that suggested he cared about his appearance without being obsessive about it. Most men I knew would be on their phones, scrolling mindlessly or texting, but he was actually reading a physical book, turning the pages carefully, occasionally taking a sip from his wine glass. Sarah was running late, texted me to order without her, and I found myself sitting 2 seats away from this intriguing stranger at the bar. I ordered my wine, pulled out my phone, and tried not to be obvious about glancing in his direction. Then he did something that seemed, at the time, like the most charming thing in the world. He looked up from his book, caught me glancing at him, smiled this warm, slightly shy smile, and said, "I know this is going to sound like a terrible line, but I promise I'm not trying to hit on you. I just noticed you look like you've had the kind of day that requires really good wine, and the bartender here is pouring you the wrong one for that kind of stress relief. May I recommend something better?" His voice was deep, cultured, with just a hint of playfulness that made me smile despite my exhaustion. I laughed, genuinely laughed for the first time all day, and said something like, "Is my terrible day really that obvious?" He closed his book, marking his page carefully, and turned to face me more directly. "I'm a psychiatrist," he explained. "I spend my days reading people's stress levels. And you, if you don't mind me saying, are carrying the weight of something significant on your shoulders. I'm Daniel, by the way. And before you ask, yes, I do realize that leading with my profession makes me sound either incredibly pretentious or like I'm trying too hard. I promise I'm neither. I'm just a guy who appreciates good wine and can recognize when someone needs a better recommendation than whatever the bartender assumes you want based on your appearance." There it was, the first hook, the perfectly calibrated introduction that made him seem observant, professional, self-aware, and charmingly humble all at once. He recommended a wine, something I'd never heard of, something he said would help me release the tension rather than just numb it. The bartender brought it over, I tasted it, and he was absolutely right. It was perfect. We started talking, and within minutes I felt like I'd known him for years. He asked about my day, really listened to my answers, made insightful observations about corporate culture and the pressure of high-stakes presentations. He shared stories about his work, carefully avoiding any breach of confidentiality, but giving me glimpses into the fascinating world of psychiatry and human behavior. When Sarah finally arrived, 40 minutes late and full of apologies, Daniel was charming to her as well, included her in the conversation naturally, and then gracefully excused himself after exchanging numbers with me. "I'd really like to take you to dinner sometime," he said, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my heart skip. "If you're interested in spending time with someone who finds you absolutely captivating." Sarah grabbed my arm the moment he left and practically squealed. "Oh my God, he's perfect. He's a psychiatrist, he's gorgeous, he's well-spoken, and did you see the way he looked at you? Girl, this is it. This is your person." I felt it too. That electric connection, that sense of meeting someone who just gets you, that rare and beautiful feeling of potential that makes you believe in destiny and soulmates and all those things cynical people say don't exist. Our first date was magical. He took me to this intimate Italian restaurant, the kind of place where they know the regulars by name and the menu changes based on what's fresh that day. He ordered in Italian, translated the menu for me, told me stories about a summer he spent in Rome during medical school. He asked me questions about my life, my dreams, my fears, my childhood, and he listened with such focused attention that I felt truly seen for the first time in my adult life. He didn't talk over me, didn't make the conversation about himself, didn't check his phone once during our 3-hour dinner. When he walked me to my car, he kissed me so softly, so perfectly, that I felt my knees literally go weak. "I know this is going to sound intense," he whispered against my lips, "but I think you're extraordinary. I think this could be something really special." Within weeks, we were inseparable. He integrated into my life seamlessly, met my friends and charmed them all, had dinner with my parents and made my mother fall in love with him before the appetizers arrived. He sent me thoughtful texts throughout the day, surprised me with my favorite flowers, remembered every little detail I mentioned in passing. He made me feel cherished, protected, understood in ways I'd never experienced before. Everyone in my life thought he was perfect. Everyone told me how lucky I was, and I believed them. I believed I had found my person, my partner, my future. I had no idea I had actually found my destroyer. The first red flags were so subtle that I didn't recognize them as warnings at all. Looking back now with the clarity that only comes from surviving something terrible, I can see them clearly, like bright neon signs flashing danger, danger, danger. But when you're in love, when you're floating in that beautiful bubble of new relationship energy, when someone has made you feel more special than you've ever felt in your life, your brain does something fascinating and terrifying. It explains away the concerning behaviors, it justifies the small cruelties, it convinces you that what you're seeing isn't really what you're seeing. The first incident happened about 2 months into our relationship. I had plans to go out with my girlfriends for Sarah's birthday, just a casual dinner and drinks. Nothing crazy, the kind of thing I'd done 100 times before. I told Daniel about it a week in advance, made sure it didn't conflict with any plans we had together, and thought nothing of it. The day of Sarah's birthday, I was getting ready at my apartment, doing my makeup and choosing between two dresses, when Daniel showed up unannounced. He had a key by then, something he'd asked for after a month of dating, explaining that it would be so much easier for him to come by after his late shifts at the hospital, that he loved the idea of being able to surprise me with breakfast in bed or have dinner ready when I got home from work. It seemed romantic at the time. Seemed like a sign of commitment and trust. He walked into my bedroom while I was holding up the two dresses, one black and fitted, one blue and flowy, trying to decide which one felt right for the evening. His expression changed the moment he saw the black dress. "You're wearing that to go out?" he asked, his tone shifting to something I hadn't heard from him before, something cold and slightly accusatory. I looked down at the dress, confused. "I was thinking about it, yeah." "Why? Do you not like it?" He walked closer, took the black dress from my hands and held it up critically. "It's very revealing, very attention-seeking. I just think, if you're going out without me, you might want to choose something more appropriate, something that doesn't send the wrong message to other men." I felt a small knot form in my stomach, a tiny voice in the back of my head saying something's not right here, but I pushed it away. "It's not that revealing," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "It's just a dress. I've worn it before. You've seen me in it." His face softened immediately, and he pulled me into his arms, kissing the top of my head. "I know, baby. I'm sorry. I'm being ridiculous. It's just that you're so beautiful, and I get worried about other guys hitting on you when I'm not there to protect you. I trust you completely. I just don't trust other men. Wear whatever you want. I'm sorry for being overprotective." He seemed so genuine, so apologetic, that I forgave him instantly. I even felt a little flattered that he was worried about other men approaching me. I changed into the blue dress, told myself it was my choice, told myself it had nothing to do with his comment. That was the beginning. The slow, careful erosion of my autonomy disguised as love and protection. Over the next few months, there were more incidents, each one individually small enough to explain away, but collectively forming a pattern I couldn't see yet. He started commenting on my friendships, suggesting that certain friends were toxic or didn't really have my best interests at heart. Sarah, my best friend since college, somehow became his primary target. "I just think she encourages you to drink too much," he'd say. "Have you noticed that every time you go out with her, you come home feeling anxious or upset about something? That's not what real friends do. Real friends make you feel good about yourself." He'd question my work commitments, suggesting that I was being taken advantage of by my boss, that I was working too hard, that my company didn't appreciate me enough. "You deserve so much better than this," he'd say while massaging my shoulders after a long day. "You're killing yourself for people who don't even see your value. Maybe it's time to look for something else, something less stressful." At first, his observations seemed caring, seemed like he was looking out for me. But slowly, imperceptibly, I started pulling away from my friends. I started declining invitations because I didn't want to deal with his subtle disappointment or his concerned questions afterward. I started doubting my own judgment about my job, about my friendships, about my own perceptions of reality. He was so skilled at it, so practiced, that every manipulation felt like love. Every boundary he pushed felt like intimacy. Every piece of my independence I surrendered felt like growing closer to him. When he proposed 9 months after we met, it felt like the natural progression of our intense connection. He took me to the beach where we'd had our first weekend getaway together, got down on one knee as the sun was setting, and said all the right things about forever and partnership and building a life together. The ring was stunning, a vintage sapphire surrounded by diamonds that he said reminded him of my eyes. My parents cried when I told them. Sarah hugged me and said she was so happy for me despite the fact that by then, I was barely seeing her once a month. Everyone celebrated our engagement. Everyone thought we were the perfect couple, and I believed I was the luckiest woman alive. The wedding planning process was when everything started to unravel, when the mask he'd been wearing so carefully began to slip, revealing glimpses of something dark and frightening underneath. At first, the planning was exciting, the way it's supposed to be when two people are building the foundation for their future together. We looked at venues, tasted cakes, discussed color schemes, and flower arrangements. But within weeks, I started noticing that every decision I tried to make was met with resistance, criticism, or outright rejection from Daniel. I wanted a small, intimate ceremony with just close friends and family, maybe 50 people max, something warm and personal where we could actually spend time with everyone who mattered to us. Daniel insisted on a large wedding, at least 200 guests, saying that his position as a respected psychiatrist meant there were professional obligations we had to honor, colleagues and contacts who would be offended if they weren't invited. I suggested a garden venue, something natural and romantic with lights strung through trees and flowers everywhere. He said garden weddings were tacky and unsophisticated, that we needed something more elegant, more prestigious, something that reflected our status as a successful couple. Every single choice became a battle. The music, the food, the photographer, the florist, even the color of the napkins. Nothing I wanted was right. Nothing I suggested was good enough, and every time I tried to assert my opinion, he would respond with either cold dismissal or explosive anger that shocked me with its intensity. The first time he truly scared me was during a meeting with our wedding planner, a lovely woman named Michelle who had been trying so hard to balance both of our visions. I had mentioned that I wanted to include a small tribute to my grandmother who had passed away the year before, maybe a special flower arrangement at the ceremony, or a moment of silence before the vows. Daniel's face went dark, his jaw clenched, and he said in a voice I barely recognized, "This wedding is about our future, not your past. I'm not going to have our special day turned into some maudlin memorial service because you can't let go of dead people." Michelle's eyes went wide, and I felt my face flush with humiliation and hurt. I tried to explain that it wasn't about making it maudlin, that it was just a small acknowledgement, but he cut me off. I said no. Drop it. The meeting ended awkwardly, and when we got to the car, I started crying. Instead of apologizing, instead of recognizing that he'd hurt me, he exploded. "Why do you always have to make everything so difficult? Why can't you just trust me to make decisions that are best for both of us? I'm trying to give us a beautiful wedding, and you're sabotaging it with your emotional nonsense and your inability to let go of the past." I sat there stunned, tears streaming down my face, unable to reconcile this cruel stranger with the man who had proposed to me on the beach just months before. But then, like always, he shifted. His face softened. He reached over and wiped my tears, and his voice became gentle again. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. The stress of planning this wedding is getting to me. I didn't mean to snap at you like that. You know I love you, right? You know I just want everything to be perfect for us?" I nodded, desperate to believe him, desperate to get back to the version of him that made me feel safe and loved. "We can include something for your grandmother," he said, kissing my hand. I was being insensitive. Of course we can honor her memory. I'm just overwhelmed with everything, with work and the wedding and trying to make sure everything is perfect for you. I forgave him. I always forgave him. Because the alternative, admitting that something was deeply wrong, admitting that maybe I'd made a terrible mistake, was too terrifying to contemplate. The pattern continued and escalated. He would be cruel, I would be hurt. He would apologize and be sweet again, and I would forgive him and try harder to not upset him. I started walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate his moods, trying to make decisions that wouldn't trigger his anger. My friends started commenting that I seemed stressed and anxious all the time. My mom mentioned that I'd lost weight and looked tired. But whenever anyone expressed concern, Daniel was right there with an explanation. "She's just stressed about the wedding," he'd tell them with a concerned, loving expression. "You know how it is. Wedding planning can be so overwhelming. I keep telling her to take it easy, but she's such a perfectionist." He isolated me further during this time, subtly but effectively. He suggested we spend more time together, just the two of us, rather than constantly being around other people. He made plans for us every weekend, elaborate dates and getaways that sounded romantic, but effectively cut me off from my friends and family. When Sarah called to make plans, I found myself declining because Daniel had already booked us a weekend trip or made reservations at some exclusive restaurant. When my mom invited us for family dinners, he'd agree to go but would be cold and withdrawn afterward, making comments about how my family was intrusive and didn't respect our relationship boundaries. I was becoming more and more isolated, more dependent on him for social connection, more convinced that maybe I was the problem, that maybe I needed to work harder to make him happy, to make our relationship work. Have you ever felt like you're slowly disappearing inside a relationship? Like the person you used to be is being erased piece by piece until you barely recognize yourself anymore? That's where I was 3 months before our wedding. Anxious, constantly on edge, doubting my own perceptions, and desperately trying to hold together this image of the perfect couple that everyone believed we were. I had become a shell of who I used to be, and I couldn't even see it yet. The final weeks before he canceled our wedding were the darkest period of my life up to that point, a descent into confusion and despair that I couldn't understand or articulate. Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic, swinging wildly between intense affection and cold detachment, in ways that left me constantly off balance and desperately trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. One moment he would pull me close, tell me how much he loved me, how excited he was to spend forever with me, how I was the best thing that ever happened to him. The next moment he would flinch when I touched him, criticize everything from the way I loaded the dishwasher to the way I laughed at something on TV, or simply ignore me completely as if I wasn't even in the room. I started keeping a mental log of his moods, trying to find patterns, trying to predict when he would be loving Daniel and when he would be cold Daniel, trying desperately to figure out what triggered the shifts so I could control them. But there was no pattern I could identify, no logic to his changes, and that unpredictability was driving me insane. The wedding was 3 weeks away when the final explosion happened, though I didn't know at the time that it was building to the cancellation. We were at the venue for our final walkthrough, confirming all the last-minute details with the coordinator, and I was actually feeling hopeful. Daniel had been in a good mood all day, had been affectionate and engaged, and I thought maybe we were finally moving past the stress and tension that had been building for months. The coordinator was showing us where the tables would be positioned, where the dance floor would go, how the ceremony space would be set up, and I was picturing it all in my mind, imagining us standing there exchanging vows, beginning our life together. Then she mentioned that the processional music I'd chosen, a beautiful classical piece that my grandmother used to play on her piano, had been changed in the system to something different. I looked at Daniel, confused, and asked if he knew anything about it. His face was completely neutral when he said, "I changed it. That piece you chose was depressing. I picked something more upbeat, more appropriate for a celebration." My heart sank. We'd discussed the music extensively. I'd explained why that particular piece meant so much to me, and he'd agreed to it. Or at least I thought he had. "But we already decided on the music," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "You said it was fine. You said we could use my grandmother's piece." He shrugged, dismissive. "I changed my mind. My choice is better." The coordinator looked uncomfortable, sensing the tension, and I felt humiliation wash over me. Here we were, weeks away from our wedding, and my fiancé was unilaterally changing decisions we'd made together without even discussing it with me. "Can we talk about this privately?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. In the parking lot, away from the coordinator's worried eyes, I tried to explain how hurt I was, how it felt like he was erasing me from our own wedding, how every decision I cared about was being overridden by him. His response was to stare at me with something approaching contempt and say, "You're being hysterical. It's just music. The fact that you're making this into such a huge issue shows me that maybe you're not mature enough for marriage after all." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Not mature enough for marriage? I was 31 years old. I had a successful career. I'd been managing my own life perfectly well before I met him, and now he was suggesting I was too immature to be his wife because I was hurt that he'd changed our wedding music without telling me. I started crying, which only seemed to make him angrier. Great. Here we go with the tears again. Every single conversation we have lately ends with you crying. Do you know how exhausting that is for me? Do you ever think about how your constant emotional instability affects me? I couldn't speak, couldn't defend myself, couldn't do anything but stand there in that parking lot feeling like I was losing my mind. Was I really being hysterical? Was I really too emotional? Was this all my fault somehow? The next 2 weeks were a blur of tension and misery. Daniel became increasingly distant, spending more time at work, coming home late, barely speaking to me except to criticize something I'd done or failed to do. My anxiety skyrocketed to levels I'd never experienced before. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, felt like I was walking through every day in a fog of confusion and pain. I kept thinking that maybe we just needed to get through the wedding, that maybe once we were married and the stress of planning was behind us, things would get better. I kept holding on to memories of how good it used to be, how perfect he'd seemed in the beginning, convinced that we could get back to that version of us if I just tried hard enough. My friends were worried about me, though I'd pushed most of them so far away by that point that they could only see glimpses of how bad things had gotten. Sarah tried to talk to me twice, asked me directly if everything was okay with Daniel, told me I didn't seem like myself anymore. I defended him, made excuses, convinced her that everything was fine, that wedding stress was just getting to both of us, that we'd be fine once we got past this difficult period. She looked at me with such sadness and said something I'll never forget. "Just promise me that if you ever need help, if you ever need to get away from him, you'll call me. No matter what time, no matter what's happening, you call me. Promise me." I promised, having no idea how soon I would need to take her up on that offer. I had no idea that in less than a week, my entire world would implode in ways I couldn't possibly anticipate. I had no idea that the man I thought I loved, the man I thought I knew, was about to reveal himself as something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. Then came the cancellation, that terrible Thursday evening that broke me in ways I didn't know a person could break. That moment when Daniel walked through our apartment door and destroyed my life with casual cruelty and calculated precision. I've already told you the basic facts of that moment, how he announced the wedding was off, how he said I wasn't who he thought I was, how he delivered the news with cold indifference to the devastation it would cause. But I haven't told you what happened after those initial words, the hours that followed, the psychological torture that he inflicted as I sat there shattered and desperate for any kind of explanation that would make sense of what was happening. After he told me the wedding was canceled, after I collapsed to my knees in shock and disbelief, I begged him to explain. I needed to understand what had changed, what I had done wrong, what had happened to make him suddenly decide he didn't want to marry me. Through my tears, barely able to form coherent sentences, I asked him over and over to please talk to me, to help me understand, to give me a chance to fix whatever was broken. He stood there watching me cry, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't identify at the time, but that I now recognize as satisfaction. He was enjoying this. He was taking pleasure in watching me fall apart. "Do you really want to know why?" he finally asked, his voice calm and measured, like he was delivering a clinical diagnosis rather than destroying someone he claimed to love. I nodded desperately, clinging to the hope that if I understood, maybe I could fix it. Maybe I could convince him we could work through whatever was wrong. He sat down on the edge of our bed, maintaining a careful distance from where I was still kneeling on the floor, and began to speak in a tone that was almost academic, detached, as if he was analyzing a case study rather than talking about our relationship. "You've become exactly what I knew you would become. Dependent, anxious, insecure, constantly seeking my validation and approval. The woman I met in that wine bar was confident and self-assured, but you're not her anymore. You're this needy, emotional thing that drains energy from everyone around you. I don't find you attractive anymore. I don't find you interesting anymore. And I certainly don't want to spend the rest of my life taking care of someone who can't even take care of herself." Each word was a knife, carefully placed to cause maximum damage. I couldn't process what I was hearing, couldn't reconcile this cruel assessment with the man who had told me I was extraordinary, who had proposed to me, who had planned an entire wedding with me. "But you're the one who wanted us to spend all our time together," I managed to say through my tears. "You're the one who said my friends were toxic and my job was too stressful. You encouraged me to depend on you. How can you now say that's the reason you don't want to marry me?" He smiled, actually smiled, and said, "Did I? Or did you make those choices yourself and now you're looking for someone to blame?" I simply offered my observations and support. "What you did with that information was entirely up to you. The fact that you chose to isolate yourself and become this dependent person isn't my responsibility. It's yours." I felt like I was in a nightmare, like reality was shifting beneath me and I couldn't find solid ground. Was he right? Had I done this to myself? Had I misunderstood everything? My brain was scrambling to make sense of his words, to reconcile his current narrative with the memories I had of our relationship, but I was too devastated, too shocked, to think clearly. He stood up then, straightened his shirt, and delivered the final blow. "I'll be staying at a hotel for a few days while you make arrangements to move out. This is my apartment, my lease, so you'll need to find somewhere else to live. I'll give you until the end of the month. That should be plenty of time." Move out? He was kicking me out? I'd given up my apartment when we moved in together 8 months ago because he'd said it made more sense financially and practically to live together. Where was I supposed to go? "Daniel, please," I begged, hating how desperate I sounded but unable to stop myself. "Please don't do this. We can go to counseling, we can work on this. I love you, I want to fix this." He looked at me with something close to pity and said, "There's nothing to fix. I'm simply correcting a mistake before it becomes permanent. You'll thank me eventually. You'll realize this is the best thing that could have happened to you." Then he picked up a bag that I only then noticed he'd already packed, walked out of our apartment, and left me there on the bedroom floor, completely destroyed and utterly alone. The aftermath of that night was the darkest period of my entire life, a descent into psychological darkness so profound that there were moments I genuinely didn't want to wake up the next day, moments when the pain was so overwhelming that non-existence seemed preferable to one more second of the agony consuming me. I don't know how long I stayed on that bedroom floor after Daniel left, hours maybe, until my legs were numb and my throat was raw from crying and my head was pounding from dehydration and emotional exhaustion. Eventually, I managed to pull myself up, stumble to the bathroom, and look at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was unrecognizable, face swollen and blotchy, eyes red and empty, a hollow shell of who I used to be. I had to call people, had to tell my parents that the wedding was off, had to notify guests and vendors, had to somehow find the strength to articulate that my life as I knew it had just disintegrated. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful, probably expecting me to share some last-minute wedding detail. "Hi, sweetheart. How are the final preparations going?" I opened my mouth to speak and instead just broke down sobbing, unable to form words, unable to do anything but cry into the phone while my mother's voice shifted from cheerful to panicked. "What's wrong? Baby, what happened? Are you hurt? Where are you?" Finally, I managed to choke out the words. "The wedding is off. Daniel canceled it. It's over." The silence on the other end was deafening, and then my mother was asking 100 questions at once, demanding to know what happened, whether I was safe, where Daniel was, why he would do this so close to the wedding. I couldn't answer most of her questions because I didn't have answers myself. I just kept saying over and over that he said he didn't want to marry me, that I wasn't who he thought I was, that it was over. My father got on the phone, his voice tight with controlled anger, and said they were coming to get me right away, that I shouldn't be alone, that I should pack a bag and come stay with them. But I couldn't imagine leaving the apartment, couldn't imagine having to face anyone, couldn't imagine existing in the world knowing that everyone we'd invited to celebrate our marriage would now hear that I'd been rejected, that I hadn't been good enough, that I'd somehow failed at the relationship everyone thought was perfect. I told them I needed some time alone, that I would call them tomorrow, and I hung up before they could argue. For 3 days, I barely moved from that apartment. I called in sick to work, ignored calls and texts from friends, and existed in a fog of grief and confusion so thick I could barely function. I slept when exhaustion finally overpowered the anxiety, woke up to the fresh devastation of remembering what had happened, and then spent hours trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. I replayed every conversation, every argument, every moment of tension, searching for the exact point where I'd failed, where I'd pushed him away, where I'd become this terrible person he described. The self-blame was suffocating. I convinced myself that he was right, that I had become too dependent, too emotional, too needy. I tortured myself with thoughts of how I could have been different, how I could have been better, how I could have kept him if only I'd been more like the woman he met in that wine bar 3 years ago. Daniel texted me once during those 3 days, a brief message saying he hoped I was making arrangements to move out, and that he'd like to come by the apartment on Sunday to pick up more of his belongings. No, how are you doing? No acknowledgement of the emotional devastation he'd caused, just a practical message about logistics and his stuff. I responded with a simple okay because I couldn't manage anything more, and that was the extent of our communication. Sarah showed up on day 4, let herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago, and found me still in the same pajamas I'd been wearing since Thursday night, surrounded by tissues and empty water bottles, looking like a disaster. She didn't say anything at first, just pulled me into her arms and let me cry on her shoulder until I had nothing left. Then she ran me a bath, made me eat something, and sat with me while I finally started to tell her everything. Not just about the cancellation, but about all the months leading up to it. All the ways Daniel had slowly broken me down. All the isolation and criticism and manipulation I'd been too ashamed to share with anyone. She listened with growing horror, tears running down her own face, and when I finished, she said something that was the first crack in the wall of self-blame I'd built. "He did this to you. You didn't become insecure and anxious because of some failing in your character. He systematically destroyed your confidence and isolated you from everyone who loved you. This wasn't your fault. This was abuse." That word, abuse, hit me like a shock. I'd never thought of it that way, never connected the dots between his behavior and that term. Abuse was physical violence, wasn't it? Abuse was obvious and dramatic, not subtle comments and criticism disguised as concern. But as Sarah started pointing out specific things I'd told her, specific patterns in Daniel's behavior, something started to shift in my understanding. The isolation from friends and family, the constant criticism that made me doubt myself, the unpredictable mood swings that kept me off balance, the way he'd blame me for his own actions, the erosion of my autonomy and confidence until I was completely dependent on him for my sense of self-worth. These weren't just the struggles of a difficult relationship. These were tactics. These were intentional. These were the hallmarks of psychological abuse. The discovery of Daniel's pattern didn't happen all at once in a dramatic revelation. It unfolded slowly, over days and weeks, through a series of small moments and observations that gradually built into a picture so horrifying that even now, safe and free, I sometimes struggled to accept that it was real. The first piece came from Sarah, who had apparently been more worried about my relationship than she'd let on, worried enough that she'd done something I initially felt was a violation, but that ultimately saved my life. She'd searched for Daniel online, really searched, beyond the professional website and LinkedIn profile that I'd seen when we first started dating. She dug through old social media posts, used variations of his name, looked for any digital footprint that might explain the man who had so thoroughly destroyed her best friend. What she found was a Facebook profile, deactivated but still visible through certain searches, from about 6 years earlier. The profile picture was unmistakably Daniel, maybe a little younger, and the relationship status had been changed multiple times over the course of a year. Single, in a relationship, engaged, single again. Sarah took screenshots of everything she could find, including comments on posts from friends congratulating him on his engagement, and then later asking what happened, why the wedding was called off, expressing concern for both him and his fiancée. One comment in particular stood out, from someone named Michael, who wrote, "Man, I hope you're getting help. This is the second time you've done this. You can't keep hurting people like this." The second time. He'd done this before, maybe more than once. Sarah was gentle when she showed me the screenshots, understanding that this information was both validating and devastating. If Daniel had a pattern of proposing to women and then canceling the wedding, then what happened to me wasn't about my failings or inadequacies. It was about his pattern, his pathology, his twisted need to enact this specific form of psychological destruction. But I needed more than screenshots of old social media posts. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, needed to know if there were other women like me, needed to find out if I'd just narrowly escaped something even worse than what I'd already experienced. I started my own investigation, carefully and methodically, using the small details I'd gathered over the months of our relationship. Daniel had mentioned an ex-girlfriend once or twice, a woman he'd dated in his late 20s, someone he described as unstable and obsessive. At the time, I'd accepted his characterization at face value, even felt a little sorry for him having to deal with someone so difficult. Now, with new awareness, I wondered if unstable and obsessive were actually descriptions of a woman who'd been psychologically abused and was trying to hold on to reality. I found her. It took some detective work, cross-referencing the few details Daniel had mentioned with people connected to his professional network, but I found her. Her name was Rebecca, and she lived 3 states away now, had moved there specifically to put distance between herself and Daniel after their relationship ended. I debated for days whether to reach out, whether I had any right to intrude on her life, whether opening old wounds would be cruel. But I needed to know, needed to understand if what I'd experienced was part of a larger pattern. I sent her a carefully worded message through LinkedIn, apologized for the intrusion, and said simply that I had been engaged to Daniel Prescott, that the relationship had ended badly, and that I was trying to understand what had happened. I didn't expect her to respond, but she did, within hours, and her message was both validating and terrifying. "We need to talk. Can I call you?" That phone conversation changed everything. Rebecca's voice was shaking when she answered, and her first words were, "Did he cancel the wedding? Did he wait until you were completely emotionally invested, until you'd given up parts of yourself, until you were dependent on him, and then did he cancel the wedding a few weeks before the ceremony?" I started crying immediately because, yes, that was exactly what he did. That was exactly the pattern, and hearing her describe it so precisely meant I wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining things, wasn't responsible for his cruelty. "He did it to me too," Rebecca said, "and he did it to at least 2 other women before me. I found them afterward when I was trying to understand what happened to me. There's a pattern. There's a very specific pattern, and you need to understand what you escaped before he comes back." Connecting the dots with Rebecca felt like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place, each revelation adding clarity to the nightmare I'd been living through, each shared experience confirming that what I'd experienced wasn't random cruelty, but calculated psychological warfare. We talked for hours, that first phone call, comparing timelines and behaviors, finding eerie similarities in how Daniel had approached each relationship, how he'd systematically dismantled each woman's sense of self, how he'd built up to the wedding cancellation with precise emotional manipulation. Rebecca told me her story, and it was like listening to my own life narrated by someone else. He'd met her at a hospital fundraiser, had been charming and attentive, had swept her off her feet with his intelligence and apparent emotional depth. The courtship had been intense, moving quickly from dating to serious commitment, with Daniel pushing for deeper connection and more time together. He'd proposed after 10 months, planned an elaborate wedding, and then had canceled it 4 weeks before the ceremony with almost the identical words he'd used with me. "You're not who I thought you were. I've made a mistake, and I'm correcting it." The emotional abuse had followed the same pattern too. The initial idealization where he made her feel like the most special person in the world, then the gradual introduction of criticism and control disguised as care and concern, the isolation from friends and family, the unpredictable mood swings that kept her constantly anxious and trying to manage his emotions. "But here's what you need to know," Rebecca said, her voice dropping lower, more urgent. "The cancellation isn't the end. It's actually the beginning of the worst phase. He wants you to fall apart completely. He wants you to beg him to come back. He wants you so destroyed and desperate that you'll accept anything, any treatment, any condition, just to make the pain stop. And if you don't play into that, if you start to recover or move on without him, he escalates." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean he escalates?" Rebecca took a deep breath, and I could hear her struggling with whether to tell me, weighing the necessity of warning me against the trauma of reliving what she'd experienced. "He came back 2 weeks after he canceled our wedding. Showed up at my apartment with flowers and tears, saying he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd been scared of commitment, that he couldn't live without me. I was so destroyed, so desperate that I took him back immediately. And that's when the real abuse started." She explained that the second phase of their relationship was exponentially worse than the first. Daniel became openly cruel, no longer bothering to disguise his manipulation as concern. He controlled every aspect of her life, her finances, her social contacts, her daily schedule. He monitored her phone and computer, tracked her location constantly, made her account for every minute she wasn't with him. The verbal abuse became constant and vicious, tearing apart her appearance, her intelligence, her worth as a person. "He was destroying me intentionally," Rebecca said, "systematically breaking down every piece of who I was. And when I finally tried to leave, when I finally got strong enough to say I was done, he threatened suicide, said he'd kill himself if I left and it would be my fault. He sent me pictures of pills, wrote me a note about how I was the reason he couldn't go on living. I stayed for 3 more months because of those threats, because I was terrified I'd be responsible for his death." Eventually, Rebecca did escape, with the help of her sister and a domestic violence counselor who helped her understand that she was being abused and that his threats were manipulation, not her responsibility. She'd moved across the country, changed her phone number, blocked him on every possible platform. But the psychological damage had taken years to recover from, years of therapy to rebuild her sense of self and learn to trust people again. "You need to prepare yourself," Rebecca warned me. "He's going to try to come back. He's going to wait until he thinks you're weak enough, desperate enough, and then he's going to show up with some story designed to pull you back in. And if you don't fall for that, if you resist him, he might try something worse. You need to protect yourself. You need to stay away from him completely." I thanked her, promised to be careful, and we exchanged information so we could stay in touch. But after we hung up, I sat there in Sarah's apartment, where I'd been staying since leaving Daniel's place, feeling a complex mix of validation, rage, and terror. Validation because everything Rebecca described matched my experience so precisely that there was no question anymore about whether I was the problem or whether I'd overreacted, or whether I'd somehow caused his behavior. This was his pattern. This was what he did. But rage, too, because how many women had he destroyed? How many lives had he systematically taken apart for his own twisted satisfaction? And how was he getting away with this? Continuing to practice as a respected psychiatrist, presenting himself to the world as a caring healer while privately enacting psychological torture on the women who trusted him with their hearts? And terror, because Rebecca's warning was clear. He wasn't done with me yet. The cancellation was just one phase in his pattern, and there were potentially worse phases to come if I didn't protect myself. I needed to be prepared. I needed to understand his full pattern. I needed to be ready for when he came back, because according to Rebecca, he always came back. The escape wasn't a single moment of decision, but rather a gradual realization that I had to actively protect myself. That surviving meant not just recovering from what had already happened, but preventing what could still happen. Rebecca had given me the contact information for the 2 other women she'd found, 2 other survivors of Daniel's pattern, and with their permission, I reached out to each of them. Their stories added more pieces to the puzzle, more confirmation of the systematic nature of his abuse, and more warning signs about what might come next. The first woman, Catherine, had dated Daniel about 8 years earlier, before he'd completed his psychiatric residency. Her experience followed the same basic pattern: intense courtship, quick engagement, cancellation of the wedding a month before the ceremony. but with some variations that were chilling in their implications. Catherine told me that after he canceled their wedding and she went through the initial devastation, Daniel had started a campaign of what she called psychological terrorism. He would show up at her workplace unexpectedly, not making a scene but just appearing where she could see him, letting her know he was watching. He would send her gifts anonymously, flowers or jewelry with no card, leaving her unsure whether they were from him or someone else. He created fake social media profiles to monitor her activity and would reference things she'd posted or conversations she'd had online in text messages, demonstrating that he was keeping tabs on her. He wanted me to feel like I could never escape him, Catherine explained. Like no matter what I did or where I went, he would always be there watching. It was about control, about making sure I knew that even though he'd rejected me, I still belonged to him in some way. Catherine had eventually filed for a restraining order after he showed up at her apartment one night, stood outside her door for over an hour whispering her name, and left when her neighbor threatened to call the police. The restraining order had worked, and Daniel had finally left her alone, but the psychological impact had been severe. She'd developed anxiety and PTSD symptoms that required years of therapy to manage. The second woman, Melissa, had dated Daniel most recently before me, about 4 years ago. Her story was the most disturbing because it included an element the others hadn't mentioned: financial abuse. Daniel had convinced Melissa to quit her job about 6 months into their engagement, telling her she was too stressed and that he made enough money to support them both. Once she was financially dependent on him, he'd used money as another tool of control, monitoring her spending, requiring her to get his permission for purchases, making her justify every expense. When he canceled their wedding, Melissa had been left with no job, no savings because he'd convinced her to put everything into their joint account that he then drained, and no immediate way to support herself. She'd had to move back in with her parents at age 29 and rebuild her entire life from nothing. The financial devastation was almost as bad as the emotional devastation, Melissa told me. I had to accept that I'd been conned, that someone I trusted had systematically stripped away my independence and my resources. I felt so stupid, so ashamed. It took me a long time to understand that this wasn't my fault, that he was skilled at this, that manipulation was his expertise. I asked Melissa if Daniel had tried to come back, tried to restart their relationship after the cancellation. Her answer made my stomach drop. Yes, he did. About 3 weeks after he canceled the wedding, he showed up at my parents' house with this elaborate story about how he'd been having a mental health crisis, how he'd been scared of commitment because of childhood trauma, how he'd realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He cried, actually cried, and begged me to give him another chance. And I almost did. I was so broken, so desperate to make sense of what had happened, that I almost believed him. What stopped her, Melissa said, was her father, who had been suspicious of Daniel from the beginning and who saw through the performance. Her father had literally stood between them and told Daniel that if he ever came near his daughter again, there would be serious consequences. Daniel had left, and Melissa had later learned that he'd started dating someone new within weeks, someone he'd likely already been seeing before he canceled their wedding. Hearing these stories, understanding the full scope of Daniel's pattern, I realized that I was in serious danger. Not physical danger necessarily, though I couldn't rule that out entirely, but psychological danger. He would come back. Based on the pattern, he would absolutely come back, and I needed to be prepared to resist whatever manipulation he deployed. I needed to be strong enough to say no, to protect myself, to not fall back into the trap of believing he could change or that we could fix what was broken. I started taking concrete steps to protect myself. I moved in permanently with Sarah, having already given up Daniel's apartment. I changed my phone number and gave the new number only to people I trusted absolutely. I blocked Daniel on every possible platform and set all my social media to private. I told my boss and HR at work about the situation, provided them with Daniel's photo, and asked them to notify security if he showed up at our office building. I documented everything from our relationship that I could remember, writing down specific incidents of manipulation and abuse in case I ever needed to file a restraining order. I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in psychological abuse and narcissistic relationships, someone who could help me understand what I'd been through and develop strategies for staying safe. Most importantly, I told people. I stopped protecting Daniel's reputation, stopped making excuses for his behavior, stopped keeping the abuse private out of shame or embarrassment. I told my family and close friends exactly what had happened, exactly what he'd done, so that they could support me and watch for warning signs that he was trying to reestablish contact. The hardest part was accepting that the man I'd fallen in love with had never really existed. He'd been a carefully constructed persona, designed to be exactly what I wanted and needed, designed to make me trust him completely so that he could then dismantle me more effectively. The real Daniel was the cold, cruel person who had canceled our wedding with those devastating words. The real Daniel was someone who got satisfaction from breaking down women, who had perfected a pattern of abuse over multiple relationships, who knew exactly how to find vulnerable targets and exploit their hopes and dreams. Then he came back, exactly as Rebecca had warned me he would, exactly according to the pattern that I now understood so clearly. It was 5 weeks after the cancellation, 5 weeks during which I'd been working hard in therapy, rebuilding my sense of self, reconnecting with friends, and starting to imagine a future that didn't include him. I was beginning to feel stronger, beginning to believe that maybe I could survive this, that maybe I could build a life beyond the destruction he'd caused. I should have known that recovery was exactly what would trigger his return, because men like Daniel don't want their victims to recover. They want them broken and desperate. And when I started showing signs of healing, when I started posting on social media again and looking happy in photos with friends, that's when he made his move. He showed up at the coffee shop near my office, the one I went to every morning before work, the one he knew I went to because it had been part of my routine throughout our relationship. I walked in, ordered my usual latte, and turned around to find him sitting at a corner table, watching me with an expression of such apparent sadness and longing that for a split second, just a heartbeat, I felt that old pull to comfort him, to make him feel better. Then I remembered. I remembered Rebecca's warning. I remembered the pattern. I remembered that this was manipulation, that this was calculated, that this was exactly what he'd done to other women before me. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing up and moving closer. "Please, just give me 5 minutes. I need to explain something to you." Every fiber of my being wanted to run, wanted to leave immediately without engaging at all. But I also knew that if I ran, he'd find another way to corner me, another opportunity to deliver whatever manipulation he'd prepared. Better to face it here, in public, with witnesses around, than to let him choose the time and place. 3 minutes, I said, keeping my voice cold and my body language closed. "You have 3 minutes, and then I'm leaving." We sat down, though I made sure to sit where I could easily get up and leave, where I had a clear path to the door, where other people could see us. He launched into his prepared speech, and it was masterful in its manipulation, hitting every emotional beat designed to pull me back in. He talked about how he'd been terrified of commitment because of trauma from his childhood, his parents' terrible divorce, his fear of repeating their mistakes. He said he'd pushed me away because he was scared of how much he loved me, because I made him feel vulnerable in ways he couldn't handle. He talked about therapy he'd supposedly been doing, insights he'd gained, work he'd done on himself. He cried, actual tears running down his face, as he told me that canceling our wedding was the biggest mistake of his life, that every day since then had been agony, that he couldn't eat or sleep or function because he missed me so much. "I know I hurt you," he said, reaching across the table like he wanted to take my hand. "I know I destroyed your trust and broke your heart, but I'm asking you, begging you, to give me a chance to prove that I can be the man you deserve. We can start over. Take things slow. Rebuild what we had. I'll do anything, anything at all, to make this right." It was a good performance. It would have worked on the woman I was 5 weeks ago, the woman who was still drowning in grief and confusion and desperate for any explanation that would make the pain make sense. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I'd talked to Rebecca and Catherine and Melissa. I'd learned about his pattern. I'd seen the blueprint he was following, and I knew that everything he was saying was a lie designed to pull me back into his web so he could complete the next phase of his abuse. I looked at him with what I hoped was complete neutrality and said, "I've talked to Rebecca, and Catherine, and Melissa. I know about your pattern. I know what you are, and I know what you do." His face changed so fast it was almost comical, the mask of sadness and regret dropping away to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. For just a moment, I saw the real Daniel, the predator without his disguise, and it was terrifying. "I don't know what lies they told you," he started, scrambling to regain control of the narrative, "but they're bitter, damaged women who can't accept their own responsibility for failed relationships. Whatever they said about me is just their distorted—" I cut him off, standing up and looking down at him with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "I'm done. Don't contact me again. Don't come to my workplace. Don't come to my home. Don't try to reach me through friends or family. If you violate this boundary, I will file a restraining order, and I will make sure that every single one of your victims tells their story publicly. I'm sure your professional reputation would love that." He stood up too, his jaw clenched, and for a moment I genuinely thought he might become physically violent. But we were in public, there were people watching, and Daniel was too controlled, too calculated to risk that kind of exposure. Instead, he leaned close and whispered, "You're going to regret this. You're going to realize what you threw away, and when you come crawling back, I won't be there." I smiled, actually smiled, and said, "That's exactly what I'm counting on." Then I walked out of that coffee shop with my head held high, my hands shaking but my resolve solid. I'd faced him. I'd resisted his manipulation. I'd protected myself. And most importantly, I'd broken his pattern. The healing process and the journey toward warning others about predators like Daniel wasn't linear or easy, but it was absolutely necessary, both for my own recovery and for potentially protecting future victims from his carefully crafted pattern of psychological destruction. After that confrontation in the coffee shop, Daniel did try a few more times to make contact, though each attempt was less aggressive than the last, as if he was realizing that I wasn't going to be pulled back in, that I wasn't going to follow the script he expected. He sent flowers to Sarah's apartment with a card that said simply, "I miss you." I threw them away without a second thought. He had a mutual acquaintance reach out to check on me, and casually mentioned that Daniel seemed to be struggling, that maybe I should give him a call. I politely but firmly told that person I wasn't interested in any information about Daniel, and asked them not to bring him up again. He even tried creating a fake Instagram account to follow me and comment on my posts, but I recognized his writing style immediately and blocked the account. Each attempt I successfully resisted made me stronger, more confident in my ability to protect myself, more certain that I'd made the right choice in walking away. I continued therapy throughout this period, working through the trauma and rebuilding my sense of identity that he'd systematically dismantled. My therapist helped me understand that what I'd experienced was a form of psychological abuse called narcissistic abuse, characterized by a predictable pattern: idealization, devaluation, and discard, often repeated cyclically. She explained that people with these tendencies specifically target empathetic, successful, confident individuals because they present a greater challenge and provide more narcissistic supply when broken down. Understanding the clinical framework for what he'd done helped me stop blaming myself, helped me see that his behavior wasn't about my inadequacies, but about his pathology. I also started connecting with a community of survivors, people who'd experienced similar patterns of manipulation and abuse in their relationships. Hearing their stories, sharing my own, and finding solidarity in our collective experiences was incredibly healing. I learned that I wasn't alone, that this particular pattern of engagement and cancellation abuse, while less common than other forms, was devastatingly effective at destroying victims' sense of self-worth. About 3 months after our final confrontation, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I decided to report Daniel to the medical board that oversaw his psychiatric license. I knew it was a long shot, knew that psychological abuse in personal relationships wasn't typically grounds for professional discipline, but I felt obligated to try. I documented everything I could about his pattern, included statements from Rebecca, Catherine, and Melissa, who had all agreed to participate, and submitted a formal complaint outlining concerns about his fitness to practice psychiatry, given his demonstrated pattern of psychological manipulation. The medical board took my complaint seriously, opened an investigation, and while I don't know all the details of what happened behind closed doors, I do know that Daniel was required to undergo his own psychological evaluation and supervision for a period of time. It wasn't the dramatic consequence I might have hoped for, but it was something, and it felt like I'd taken action to potentially protect others, both his patients and future romantic partners. I also took Rebecca's advice and created a detailed document outlining Daniel's pattern, his tactics, his warning signs, everything I'd learned from my own experience and from talking with his other victims. I shared this document with trusted friends and family, people who might encounter him or people who might meet women dating him in the future. Knowledge was protection, and the more people who knew what he was capable of, the harder it would be for him to continue his pattern unchallenged. The most profound part of my healing came from reconnecting with myself, with the confident, successful, vibrant woman I'd been before Daniel systematically destroyed her. I went back to activities I'd abandoned during our relationship, reconnected with friends I'd pushed away, pursued career opportunities I'd been too anxious to consider when I was constantly managing his moods and criticism. I started running again, something I'd loved before I met him, but stopped when he made comments about my body changing. I took a solo trip to Italy, something I'd always wanted to do, but he'd dismissed as impractical. I threw myself into a major project at work and earned a promotion I'd been too insecure to pursue when I was with him. Each reclaimed piece of myself, each demonstration of my competence and independence, was a rejection of the narrative he'd tried to impose, the story that I was inadequate and unworthy and fundamentally flawed. About 6 months after our final confrontation, I heard through the grapevine that Daniel had started dating someone new. My first instinct was panic, fear for this new woman who had no idea what she was walking into, who was probably experiencing the same intense courtship and love bombing that I'd experienced in the beginning. I debated whether I had any right or responsibility to warn her, whether she'd even believe me if I tried. After discussing it with my therapist and with the other survivors, I decided to write her a letter, carefully worded to not sound like a crazy ex, but to plant seeds of awareness about potential warning signs. I sent the letter anonymously, enclosed copies of the medical board complaint and statements from multiple women, and left it up to her what she did with the information. I don't know if she read it, don't know if it made any difference, but I felt I'd done what I could without crossing ethical boundaries or putting myself at risk. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever found yourself in a relationship that started perfectly but slowly became something unrecognizable? Comment below, because recognizing these patterns and talking about them openly is how we protect each other from predators who hide behind masks of charm and sophistication. Today, 2 years after that terrible day when Daniel canceled our wedding, I'm sitting here recording this story from a place of genuine happiness and strength that I never thought I'd feel again during those dark weeks after the breakup. I want to be really clear about something. Recovery from psychological abuse isn't a straight line, isn't a simple process of feeling bad and then feeling better. It's messy and complicated, full of setbacks and breakthroughs, days when you feel strong and days when you doubt everything you know about what happened to you. But I'm here, I'm whole, and I'm using my experience to help others recognize and escape similar situations. I'm in a new relationship now, with someone who treats me with consistent respect and kindness, someone who celebrates my independence rather than trying to control it, someone whose love makes me feel more myself rather than less. The contrast between this healthy relationship and what I experienced with Daniel is stark, and it's taught me so much about what real love looks like versus what manipulation disguised as love looks like. Real love doesn't isolate you from people who care about you. Real love doesn't require you to become smaller or less confident to make your partner feel better. Real love doesn't punish you with withdrawal and contempt when you express needs or boundaries. Real love doesn't follow predictable patterns of idealization and devaluation designed to keep you off balance and desperate for approval. I've also become an advocate for raising awareness about psychological abuse and narcissistic patterns in relationships. I volunteer with a local domestic violence organization, sharing my story in support groups and helping newly escaped victims understand that what they experienced wasn't love, wasn't their fault, and doesn't define their worth or their future. The number of people I've met who have similar stories, who've been targeted by predators who follow these calculated patterns of destruction, is both heartbreaking and validating. This isn't rare. This isn't unique to me or to Daniel. This is a widespread pattern of abuse that thrives in silence and shame. I've learned to recognize the red flags that I missed in the beginning with Daniel, the subtle signs that someone is more interested in control than connection. The love bombing phase where everything moves too fast and feels too intense too soon. The isolation that gets framed as wanting to spend quality time together. The criticism that gets disguised as concern or helpfulness. The unpredictable mood swings that keep you constantly trying to manage their emotions. The gradual erosion of your confidence and autonomy. The way they rewrite history and make you doubt your own perceptions. These are not signs of a complicated person or a struggling relationship. These are tactics, and recognizing them early can save you from years of trauma. To anyone watching this who sees themselves in my story, who recognizes patterns in their own relationship that match what I've described, I want you to hear this. You are not crazy. You are not too sensitive. You are not imagining things. Trust your instincts. Trust that voice inside you that says something is wrong, even if you can't quite articulate what it is. Even if your partner has explanations for everything. Even if everyone else thinks your relationship looks perfect from the outside. That voice is trying to protect you. Listen to it. And if you need to leave, if you need to escape a situation that's hurting you, please know that it's possible. Reach out to friends and family, even if you've been isolated from them. Contact domestic violence resources even if there's no physical abuse, because psychological abuse is real abuse and you deserve support. Document everything if you can, in case you need to take legal action or file for a restraining order. And most importantly, understand that the hardest part is making the decision to leave. But once you're out, once you're safe, once you start the healing process, you will be amazed at how strong you actually are, how much resilience you have, how beautiful life can be without someone constantly tearing you down. If this story has touched your heart, if it's helped you understand something about your own experiences or someone you love, please leave a like on this video. Understanding the tactics of psychological abusers and narcissistic predators is the first step toward protecting ourselves and others from their destruction. Subscribe to I Live to Tell for more stories of survival, resilience, and the courage it takes to escape dangerous situations. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might save your life or help you recognize warning signs in your own relationships. And please, share your own experiences or thoughts in the comments below. Creating a community where we can talk openly about these patterns, where survivors feel heard and validated, where potential victims can learn to recognize red flags, that's how we fight back against predators like Daniel. That's how we break the cycle of abuse. That's how we protect each other. I live to tell my story, and in telling it, I've reclaimed the power Daniel tried to take from me. You can too. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And remember, you deserve love that builds you up, not love that tears you down. You deserve a partner who celebrates your strength, not one who systematically destroys it. You deserve happiness, safety, and freedom. Never settle for anything less.